If you hand a child an iPad and, they smile, they laugh, and play with it for 20 straight minutes, is that iPad a reinforcer?
Oh, I mean, most people would instantly say yes.
Right. But if you instinctively answered yes, you might be walking directly into a trap, like a trap that could honestly cost you your passing score on the BCBA 6th edition certification exam.
Absolutely. It's such a common mistake.
So, welcome to the deep dive. This is Behavioral Intelligence Con Mara Sánchez, and we are talking directly to you, the dedicated learner, the one grinding away, parsing through all this technical jargon to completely master Domain B2.
Yeah, Domain B2 is, it's foundational. It demands that you identify and distinguish between a stimulus and a stimulus class.
Which sounds simple but isn't.
Not at all. It's totally notorious for exposing the gap between our everyday, colloquial language and strict behavioral science.
Okay, let's unpack this. To help you bridge that gap today, we've got a phenomenal stack of sources on the desk.
We really do.
Yeah, we're pulling heavily from the comprehensive BAS 6th edition study guides. We've got some translated excerpts from the Cooper text, which is basically the Bible of applied behavior analysis.
And the bedrock of ABA, for sure.
Exactly. And we are also dissecting some of the most deceptively tricky mock exam questions, like the ones designed specifically to test your clinical application.
Because, look, the exam writers, they know exactly how you speak in your daily life.
Oh, they totally know.
Yeah, they know you use words like reward or trigger super loosely. So their goal is to see if you can, strip away those assumptions and just observe the environment through this uncompromising lens of measurable data.
Right. But before we can even touch on how behavior analysts group things into a class, we kind of have to isolate the fundamental unit of behavior analysis, right?
Right, we have to decode the stimulus itself.
And according to the Cooper text, to define a stimulus, we first have to define the space where it actually happens, the environment.
Which the text defines as everything but the moving parts of an organism.
See, wait, I have to push back on that boundary just a little bit.
Go ahead.
Because that phrase, everything but the moving parts of an organism, it sounds like, I don't know, a robotic cyborg manual or something.
It does sound a bit mechanical, yeah.
Right. And if the environment is strictly the universe outside of my physical action, well, how does behaviorism handle internal events?
That is a really brilliant distinction.
Like, what if a client has a severe stomach ache and starts engaging in self-injurious behavior? Does behavior analysis just ignore the stomach ache entirely because it's inside the organism?
No, not at all. And that's a really common point of confusion for test takers. Radical behaviorism, which is the philosophy underlying ABA, it does not ignore internal events.
Okay, good. Because that would seem like a huge oversight.
Exactly. B.F. Skinner was actually very clear that the boundary of the skin doesn't just change the physical laws of the universe.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. So a stomach ache is still a physical energy change. It's just what we call a private event. It happens within the skin, so it's only accessible to the person experiencing it, but it's still part of their internal environment.
It still functions lawfully.
Precisely. So within that total environment, inside and outside, we have the individual stimuli. The BACB terminology defines a stimulus strictly as an energy change that affects an organism through its receptor cells.
Okay, I always try to map these highly technical definitions to something I can actually visualize.
What's your go-to analogy?
So I kind of compare that definition to the physics engine of a massive open-world video game.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. So the environment is the totality of the game's code, right? The rendered digital world, the weather systems, all that background process.
The whole context.
Exactly. But the stimulus is a specific active shift in that code that the player character's sensors actually register.
Like what specifically?
Like a sudden light flare on the screen, or the controller vibrating in your hands, or an enemy suddenly spawning into your field of view. If the character's digital sensors detect it, boom, it's a stimulus.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the mechanism of observation. I mean, behavior analysis relies heavily on determinism.
The idea that behavior is lawful.
Right. It occurs due to specific observable conditions. We can't really measure a client's frustration or their anxiety because those are mentalistic constructs.
Or just guesses, essentially.
Exactly. We can, however, measure the decibel level of a fire alarm. We can measure the ambient temperature of a clinic room.
Or the presentation of a really complex math worksheet.
Yes. We measure the physical energy change hitting the receptor cells. By defining a stimulus that's strictly something you can see, hear, smell, taste, or feel, we ensure our interventions are based on objective reality.
Instead of just subjective guesswork.
Exactly.
But if that isolated energy change is, like, our single pixel, the clinical reality is that the environment never just gives us one pixel at a time.
Oh, never.
A classroom or a therapy clinic is bombarding the learner with thousands of concurrent stimuli every single second. The fluorescent lights are humming, a chair is scraping the floor.
The therapist is talking. There's a visual schedule on the wall.
Right. Which brings us to making sense of all that noise. Because the brain naturally organizes this chaos, and as behavior analysts, you have to understand how to categorize these stimuli to actually manipulate the environment effectively.
And that is the exact transition from a single stimulus to a stimulus class.
Which the BAS study guide defines as any group of stimuli that share common elements. But we don't just group things arbitrarily. There are 3 specific dimensions, right?
Yes, 3 dimensions used to categorize a stimulus class: formal, temporal, and functional. And mastering the distinction between these 3 is honestly non-negotiable for passing domain B2.
Okay, let's start with the formal dimension, because this one feels the most grounded in, like, physical reality.
It is. The formal dimension groups stimuli by their physical features or their topography. So stimuli in a formal class share observable physical properties.
Like they share the same color or size or weight.
Exactly, or even the same spatial positioning.
So a quick example would be a visual schedule on a wall, a stop sign on the street, and a red traffic light.
Right.
You could group them formally by color, or even just by the fact that they're all visual stimuli, light waves hitting the retina.
Perfect example. And the clinical application of the formal dimension actually appears a lot in prompting procedures.
Oh, like physical prompts.
Yeah. If you're using physical prompts with a learner, maybe a light touch to the elbow, a full physical hand-over-hand prompt, or just a tap on the shoulder, those all belong to a formal stimulus class of tactile stimuli.
Because they share the physical property of applying pressure to the skin.
You got it.
Okay, so the formal dimension is about physical topography, how it looks or feels. Next up is the temporal dimension. And temporal obviously refers to time.
It does. In a temporal stimulus class, we are grouping stimuli strictly by their location and time relative to the behavior of interest.
So what it looks like doesn't matter at all here.
Not at all. The physical topography is totally irrelevant. We are only looking at the timeline.
And in ABA, the timeline is basically always the 3-term contingency, right? Antecedent, behavior, consequence.
That is the absolute most critical temporal distinction you're going to make on the test. Any stimulus that occurs prior to the behavior belongs to the temporal class of an antecedent.
And anything after is a consequence.
Right. So a teacher handing out a worksheet and a peer calling the learner a bad name, they might look formally completely different. But if they both happen immediately before the learner flips their desk, they are both in the antecedent temporal class.
Man, that makes so much sense. Which brings us to the third category. Here's where it gets really interesting.
The functional dimension.
Yes. This is where the science gets so incredibly elegant, but also kind of highly abstract.
It does, because the functional dimension ignores what the stimuli look like entirely, and it ignores when they happen.
So what does it care about?
It groups stimuli purely based on their effect on behavior. If multiple totally different stimuli evoke the exact same response, boom, they belong to the same functional stimulus class.
I want to dig into that classic example from the Cooper text on this, because it really forces you to rethink how the brain even works.
The reading example.
Yeah. Cooper uses the words forest, lime, moss, and olive.
Such a great illustration.
Right. Because formally, the letters MOSS do not share any physical properties with, like, a literal bucket of wet green paint.
They don't look alike, they don't smell alike.
Exactly. But if I point to the wet paint, or if I just read the word moss on a piece of paper, they both evoke the exact same verbal response from you. You say the word green.
And the Cooper text classifies these as arbitrary stimulus classes. They're arbitrary because the stimuli share literally no physical analogous characteristics.
So the question you should be asking as a test taker is, how does a learner ever figure out that MOSS and a bucket of paint belong in the same class?
Exactly, because we certainly aren't born knowing that. The environment basically has to physically rewrite the code in our brain to link those completely unrelated pixels together.
How does that mechanism actually work in practice?
It works through a massive history of differential reinforcement, often resulting in what we call stimulus equivalence.
Oh, right.
Think about it. Throughout your life, you were reinforced for tacting the color of moss as green. You were reinforced for reading the word green when shown a lime.
So my learning history built these invisible functional bridges between these totally dissimilar things.
Exactly. And now, They all exert the exact same stimulus control over your verbal behavior.
That is wild. And because we can form these invisible links between unrelated objects, it's got to be incredibly easy for a learner's brain to accidentally wire the wrong things together, right?
Oh, it happens all the time. Which is a perfect transition into looking at clinical and everyday examples. The exam won't just ask you to recite the definition of an arbitrary stimulus class.
No, they're going to give you a scenario.
Right, they'll give you a clinical scenario and ask you to identify the process at play.
So let's look at a clinical example of teaching a concept. Let's say we are teaching a young learner the concept of red.
Well, teaching a concept requires two psychological mechanisms to fire concurrently: stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination.
Okay, let's break those down.
First, the learner needs stimulus generalization. So you present a red block, a red toy car, and a red flashcard. And you reinforce the learner for saying red in the presence of all three.
So they are generalizing their response across different stimuli that share that formal property, the color red.
Precisely. But if you stop there, you have a major problem.
Because they might just start calling everything red.
Exactly, which is why stimulus discrimination is the mandatory second half of concept formation.
You have to set the boundaries.
Yes. You must present the red toy car alongside, say, a blue toy car. You reinforce the response red for the red car, and you withhold reinforcement. You place the response on extinction when they say red to the blue car. You are teaching them the boundaries of that stimulus class.
That dynamic of generalization and discrimination shows up constantly on the mock exams. There is this hilarious but totally relatable scenario from mock exam 1 about stimulus generalization gone wrong.
Ah, the toddler scenario.
Yes. Okay, so we have a toddler named Amy. Her father has a very prominent beard and mustache. And Amy has successfully learned to look at her father and say, "Da-da."
So far, so good.
Right. But now, Amy's mother takes her walking down a really busy street, and Amy starts aggressively pointing at literally every single man walking by who has a beard, shouting "da-da" at them.
What's fascinating here is that we can map the exact mechanics of what is happening in Amy's environment.
Let's do it.
The formal dimension of the stimulus, the physical topography, is facial hair. In the past, when Amy saw that formal property on her father and vocalized dada, she received massive reinforcement.
Her dad probably smiled, picked her up, gave her tons of attention.
Exactly. The environment coded facial hair as the trigger for the reward. So because other men on the street share that exact same formal property, those novel stimuli evoke the exact same response.
She basically grouped way too many pixels into the data class.
She overgeneralized, yes.
So as the behavior analyst consulting on this, you'd have to introduce discrimination training.
You'd utilize differential reinforcement. The goal is to establish her actual father as the discriminative stimulus, or the SD.
The SD is a stimulus in the presence of which a specific behavior has been reinforced in the past, right?
Correct. So when she calls her father dada, the parents provide massive reinforcement.
But what about the random guys on the street?
They must become the stimulus delta, or the S delta. That's a stimulus in the presence of which a given behavior has not produced reinforcement in the past.
So when Amy points to a stranger and says dada,
the mother withholds the reinforcement. She doesn't laugh. She doesn't make a big deal out of it. She might just provide a neutral correction, like, that's just a man.
And over hundreds of those micro-interactions, she learns to discriminate.
Exactly. Her behavior comes under the correct stimulus control.
I want to elevate this to an even more complex clinical example. Let's talk about arbitrary functional classes in the context of problem behavior, because this is honestly where BCBA really earns their certification.
That is a critical application. Okay, let's say you have a client with a severe learning history regarding escape behaviors. And the target behavior is the client flipping their desk and attempting to elope from the room.
Right. And you observe the client, and you notice this desk flipping happens in 3 specific situations. First, when a teacher hands them a complex math worksheet. Second, when the fire alarm goes off in the hallway. And third, when a specific staff member simply furrows their brow and sighs loudly.
Okay, let's analyze that. Formally, those 3 stimuli share absolutely nothing. A piece of paper, a high decibel siren, and a minor facial movement from a human being.
Nothing in common physically.
Temporally, they are all antecedents. But functionally, they all evoke the exact same magnitude of escape behavior.
So they form an arbitrary functional stimulus class.
Yes. The client's learning history has linked the worksheet, the alarm, and the furrowed brow as equivalent threats, signaling that an aversive condition is present.
And if you don't understand how to identify that functional class, you are going to design a terrible intervention.
Oh, completely. You might try to treat the math worksheet issue as an academic deficit while totally ignoring the staff member's facial expressions.
Understanding domain B2 allows you to see those invisible threads connecting those environmental events, so you can actually treat the functional class as a whole.
And this level of clinical objectivity is exactly what the BCBA exam is hunting for.
Which leads us to the most crucial part of our deep dive today: easing the exam and navigating the traps. Because the test writers will present you with scenarios that sound like everyday life and expect you to filter the narrative out.
The absolute most common trap you will face regarding stimuli is confusing a plain stimulus with a reinforcer.
Okay, let's pull up this specific scenario from BAS Mock Exam 1, question 107. This is what I call the iPad trick.
It's a classic.
The question stem sets the scene. A therapist named Shonda is working in a clinic with a boy named Timmy. Shonda asks Timmy to touch his nose. Timmy just stares at her and does not respond.
Okay.
So Shonda uses a partial physical prompt, gently guiding his hand to his nose. Immediately after his hand touches his nose, she hands him an iPad. Timmy's face lights up, he smiles, and he plays his favorite game on the iPad for 30 seconds.
Sounds great so far.
Right. Then Shonda takes the iPad back and asks Timmy to touch his nose again. Timmy does not respond.
Okay, and then the exam asks, what is the iPad in this specific scenario? And the multiple choice options will be highly tempting.
They'll offer positive reinforcer, negative reinforcer, unconditioned stimulus, and simply stimulus.
And as we mentioned at the very beginning of this deep dive, if you ask any parent or even a junior technician what the iPad is,
They'll say, it's a reward, it's a positive reinforcer, he smiled, he played with it, it's highly preferred.
but the correct answer on the exam is simply a stimulus.
So what does this all mean? Walk us through the exact behavioral mechanics of why that is. Why does the everyday vernacular completely betray us here?
Well, this raises an important question about how we label environmental events. In applied behavior analysis, the definition of a consequence is dictated entirely by the data.
Not by cultural assumptions or the learner's emotional reaction.
Exactly. A stimulus is just an energy change. For that stimulus to earn the highly specific title of a positive reinforcer, it must meet two strict criteria. First, it must be presented immediately following a behavior.
Which Shonda did. She handed him the iPad right after the prompted nose touch.
She did. But the second criterion is where the trap snaps shut. The presentation of that stimulus must result in an observable increase in the future frequency of that specific behavior under similar conditions.
The data dictates the definition.
Yes. Look at the final sentence of your scenario. Shonda asks Timmy to touch his nose again. Timmy does not respond.
The rate of the behavior remained at 0.
The behavior did not increase. Therefore, the iPad failed to reinforce the behavior. Functionally, it had no reinforcing effect whatsoever.
It doesn't matter that he smiled, or that it's his favorite toy.
Not one bit. The smile is a respondent behavior. It is entirely separate from the operant, nose-touching behavior we are measuring.
Wow.
In the strict, unyielding terms of the exam, the iPad in that moment is just a neutral piece of glass and metal-emitting light. It's an energy change affecting his receptor cells. It is a mere stimulus.
That is a brilliant trap. The exam writers literally weaponize your empathy. You want to believe Timmy was rewarded because he was happy.
But you have to shut off your colloquial brain and turn on your radical behaviorist brain. If the data shows a flat line, it's just a stimulus.
That's tricky.
Let's analyze another common exam trap regarding temporal classes. The exam loves to blur the lines between antecedents and consequences within a behavior chain.
Oh, this is a great one. Give us a scenario.
Imagine a scenario where a learner is given a math worksheet. The learner completes the first problem correctly. The teacher immediately hands the learner a physical token.
Okay.
The learner then takes that token and places it onto their token board. The exam asks, what temporal class does the physical token belong to?
I bet the options will try to force you in choosing between antecedent or consequence.
Exactly. But you have to analyze the behavior of interest. The token functions as a consequence for the behavior of completing the math problem.
Because it happens after the math is done.
Right. However, that exact same physical token also functions as an antecedent stimulus for the subsequent behavior of placing it on the token board.
It occasions the next step in the chain. So it's both.
Depending entirely on which specific behavior you are analyzing in the moment, yes. The exam tests your ability to isolate the specific behavior-environment interaction.
So you really can't assign a permanent label to a stimulus.
No, its temporal and functional classification is completely fluid.
That is phenomenal advice for navigating these questions. You really just have to look at the isolated interaction. All right, let's take a breath and synthesize this massive amount of ground we've covered today for your study plan,
We started at the absolute baseline, defining the environment as everything outside the moving parts of the organism.
which includes private events under the skin.
Right. And we isolated the fundamental pixel of our science, the single energy change affecting receptor cells, which is the stimulus.
From there, we explored how the chaos of reality basically forces us to categorize those pixels into stimulus classes based on 3 dimensions.
Formal, mapping the physical topography. Temporal, mapping the timeline of antecedents and consequences.
And functional, which is that incredibly powerful mechanism that groups completely unrelated physical objects based purely on their effect on behavior.
We examined how those arbitrary functional classes are built through complex histories of differential reinforcement, and how they dictate everything from teaching a child the concept of red to managing severe escape behaviors triggered by a furrowed brow.
And finally, we dismantled the exam writer's favorite traps. We learned to never trust a smile, to let the data dictate the definition of a reinforcer, and to remember that the function of a stimulus changes depending on the specific link in the behavior chain you are actually observing.
If you approach Domain B2 with that level of clinical objectivity, stripping away everyday assumptions, you'll definitely secure those points on the exam.
Before we wrap up today, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We spend so much time analyzing our clients' arbitrary stimulus classes, but think about your own.
It is a fascinating exercise, really.
Yeah. If our entire subjective reality and our most visceral behaviors are shaped by how our unique learning history has unconsciously grouped arbitrary stimuli into functional classes, could mapping out our own personal stimulus classes be the ultimate key to understanding our deepest human biases?
It's a deep thought. If 2 completely different types of people or 2 completely different political situations evoke the exact same emotional and behavioral response in you, what invisible, arbitrary functional class has your learning history created?
It completely flips the script.
Yeah.
We're not just looking at the mechanics of behavior analysis to pass a test. We're looking at the fundamental code that makes up our own subjective reality.
It's powerful stuff.
Take these insights, apply them ruthlessly to your mock exams, and keep studying ABA concepts through this podcast series. Follow Amethyst Therapy Services for more resources. You can visit them at www.amethysttherapyservices.com or email them at info@amethysttherapyservices.com. Go absolutely crush that BCBA certification test. You've got this. We'll see you on the next deep dive.